Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The moment that would break him came with the sound of her whisper, a single shattered breath that didn't belong to the woman he thought he'd rescued. Cale Ransom stood in the doorway of his weather-beaten cabin, staring down at the Apache woman lying on his cot, her skin pale beneath the dried blood and dust. He'd dragged her from the canyon floor hours earlier, believing he had saved a stranger in need. But now, under the flicker of the lantern, she stirred, her voice trembling through cracked lips as she spoke a name no one else alive should have known. His name. Not the one folks used, not the one he'd carried across territories. The old one. The hidden one. Rohani, she whispered. A name from a past he had buried in the desert like a corpse. Kyle froze, breath caught deep in his chest. No Apache should know that name. No living soul should have been able to speak it. And yet she had. Soft. Certain. Like she'd been waiting to say it. His heart slammed against his ribs as dread pooled in his stomach. "Who are you?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer would change everything. Outside, the desert wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling loose boards like bones shaking in a shallow grave. Kyle stepped closer, each movement slow, cautious, the way a man approached a rattlesnake he wasn't sure was dead. Her eyes opened. Dark, unblinking, ancient. The eyes of someone who had seen too much and survived more than any person should bear. When she tried to sit up, pain twisted across her face, and Cale instinctively reached out. But she flinched back as though his touch carried fire. "Don't," she rasped. "Not yet." The words chilled him. Not because of the tone, but because she spoke them in his mother's language, a tongue no one in these lands should have known. His pulse hammered violently. The lantern light caught on something around her neck, a leather cord holding a small silver emblem. Kyle felt his throat tighten. He recognized it. He'd seen it only once before, on the day his mother died. That emblem had burned in his memory ever since. The woman saw his shock and whispered, "You shouldn't have saved me, Kyle Ransom. My people, they will come for me. And for you." Kyle staggered back, the cot creaking under her weight as she shifted. A cold sweat slicked his palms. The memory he'd outrun for 15 years rose up like a ghost, his mother's voice screaming, his father's blood soaking into the earth. The emblem, this exact emblem, pressed into his hand as she whispered, "Run." He had buried that life, buried the name Rohani, buried the truth of who he was and what had happened that night. No one left alive should have known. The Apache woman breathed sharply, her body trembling with exhaustion. "My name is Sani," she said at last, voice thin but steady. "And I know what was taken from your family. I know who took it." Kyle's heart lurched. The air felt suddenly thin, as though the cabin were shrinking around him. Sani's eyes locked onto his, and something fierce, something haunted, flickered in their depths. "But you must listen," she added, struggling for breath. "Saving me has made you part of it again." Kyle swallowed hard. "Part of what?" he whispered. Sani's answer came like a blade sliding between ribs. "The lie your father died to protect." Lightning cracked somewhere beyond the ridgeline, lighting up the cabin for a brief, white-hot moment. Kyle stared at her, mind scrambling, heart buckling under the weight of old memories he'd sworn never to face. Sani tried to rise again, gripping Kyle's sleeve with surprising strength. Her fingers trembled, but her voice did not. They're already tracking me, she warned. Your land is marked. Your scent. Your horse. Everything. You saved the wrong woman. Kyle Ransom. Wrong woman. The phrase twisted in Kyle's chest like a knife. This wasn't some lost traveler. This wasn't a wounded stranger. This was a woman who carried the past on her back like a curse, and she had dragged that curse straight into his home. Tell me what you know, Cale demanded, more harshly than he intended. She shook her head weakly. Not yet. If I speak too soon, you'll run again. Again. As if she had been there when he fled his childhood home. As if she'd watched him vanish into the desert night. Cale's breath hitched. How do you know anything about me? He whispered. Sonny's eyes softened, tired and unbearably sad. Because your father saved me first. Silence fell so heavy it felt like the desert itself had stopped breathing. Kyle stared at her, unable to move, unable to blink, unable to think past the sudden roaring in his ears. His father. Dead for 15 years. A memory carved into dust. You're lying, Kyle breathed, though his voice cracked. Sonny shook her head. Your father saved me when I was a child. Saved me the same way you saved me today. But the men who hunted me, they didn't forgive him. She looked at the emblem hanging from her neck and touched it with trembling fingers. He gave me this, told me to keep it safe until the day his son came looking for the truth. Cale's knees nearly buckled. The truth, the past, the name he buried, all of it rushing back like a storm that had been waiting on the horizon for years. Sonny's voice softened into a whisper. Your father died for a secret you were never meant to uncover. She paused, her gaze piercing. But now, it's too late. Because the people who killed him, they know you saved me. And they're coming. Outside, a distant drumbeat echoed across the valley. Not thunder, hoofbeats. Kyle woke before dawn, the lantern guttering as if afraid to stay lit. The memory of Sonny's whisper, Rohani, clung to him like cold dew. He dressed without thinking, fingers finding the familiar weight of his father's knife in the boot where he kept it. Outside, Redstone Ridge lay blue and hard, the sky a slab of iron that promised heat later. Cale's mind moved in the slow, stubborn circles of a man who had practiced forgetting. He had left his father's life the way a man leaves a burning house, without looking back. He had changed his name at a town line, carved a new face from the raw bone of survival, and lived under that name for a decade. But the emblem Sonny wore, the one he remembered from his mother's palm, was a bridge he could not cross without drowning. He walked to the shed and checked his horse, a green-eyed mare named Lark, and felt the old fear, not of bandits or bullets, but of the truth that lay folded like a map inside his chest. The truth itched like a burr. Someone had kept his father's memory alive, and they had just walked into his cabin. The valley remembered his childhood, with quieter cruelty than he did. When he was young, their homestead had sat on a different ridge, closer to the river that looked like glass in winter. His father, Tomas Ransom, a man as strong as the cedar posts he drove, had been both mercy and storm. Tomas had kept secrets in jars, tied shut with twine, papers, a small purse of coins, a single silver crest with a thunderbird engraved. Kyle had once watched his father press that crest into the palm of a bleeding boy from a nearby tribe, whispering promises that belonged to another life. He had thought those promises noble then, childlike and pure. The night came when men with dark coats and sharper knives rode under the moon and took those promises by fire. Kyle had ridden and run, and by morning the house was ash, and his name was Ash too. He told himself he left to survive. But sometimes Survival had looked like abandoning the only thing that made him human. Memory. Sanny's sleeping breath was ragged when Cale returned to the cabin after saddling Lark. He watched her, the way light fell on the hard planes of her face, how the dust caught in the lines at her eyes. She had the steady jaw of someone who had learned to carry more than her weight. She also carried a softness when she thought no one saw, a thumb that smoothed the leather of her satchel as if soothing an old wound. Cale wanted to pry open every secret she held, to tear the story loose from her chest piece by piece, but he also wanted to keep her safe from the men she feared. Third-person limited tightened around him. He could not know her past the way she did, only the shards she let fall near him. He found himself listening for sounds, the valley's bird call, the distant creak of a wagon, the hoarse cough of an early rider. He told himself he'd ask questions at noon after sun warmed the plains and made thought easier. But noon could be too late. He fed Sani a thin broth, watched her lift her head with an effort that made his chest ache, and promised, silently, to learn everything she refused to say. By mid-morning, the town of Blackwater Gulch stuttered awake like a man rubbing sleep from his eyes. Kyle led Lark down the wagon path and kept to the shadows of buildings that seemed older than their owners. Blackwater was a place of thin words and thinner loyalties, a single saloon, a general store, a post office that smelled of paper and moths. He tied Lark at the hitch and moved through the town like a man wearing someone else's shoes. People nodded, measured him. The town knew Cale Ransom by the way he carried his grief. Steady, half-hidden. Kyle found an old friend, Marek, who ran the blacksmith stall on the edge of town, a broad-shouldered man with hands like anvils and eyes wry as worn coins. Marek had been a boy when Thomas Ransom disappeared. He didn't ask why Kyle had returned. Instead, he said only what men who live with loss know. If your past has teeth, it'll find you. Marek's words made Kyle grit his teeth. He had thought himself clever enough to bury every map, every mark that led back to his father. Doubt coiled under his ribs. Had the men who killed Thomas grown smarter? Had they waited, watched, and kept him in their scopes like prey? That afternoon, Kyle brought Sani a blanket and left her in the cabin's shade while he followed a trail of whispers. The small silver crest, the emblem, had been common to a handful of families in a different county, families who owed favors and suffered debts like teeth marks. Kyle had memorized names. Now he traced them again. Ivor Knoll, a crooked judge who liked to hide his hands in velvet. Bram Doss, a moneylender with a laugh like a pistol. A captain named Redden, who'd once chased Thomas. Names like bad weather. Each one pulled at a thread inside Cale's memory until he felt his childhood like a shirt being peeled off. He had left to live under a new sky, but the sky was the same sky. He found himself at the old cemetery beneath Redstone Ridge, the place he had thought to visit and then always avoided. Stones leaned like tired men. He crouched at a single grave, unmarked, hands raw with dirt, and pressed his palm to cold earth as if to prove it real. Sani's face in his mind burned brighter than the noon sun. He had saved her life. That act had opened a door he thought permanently closed. As he stood, the wind shifted, bringing distant hoofbeats toward town. Not the easy plod of traders, but the focused rhythm of men who knew where they were going. The hoofbeats grew louder as Cale stepped from the cemetery, their rhythm tightening the air like a rope around his ribs. He stood still, boots sinking slightly into the dust, watching 4 riders crest the ridge. They were dressed in dark coats despite the heat, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. Not bandits, not drifters. These were men who rode with purpose, men who carried silence like a weapon. Kyle's fingers brushed the handle of his father's knife, but he didn't draw it. Drawing too soon could turn suspicion into war. The riders stopped 10 paces away, horses snorting steam into the warming air. The tallest man, with a coat the color of dried blood, lifted his chin. "Morning, Ransom," he said, though Kyle had never given him that name. A chill crawled under Kyle's skin. Whoever these men were, they hadn't come by mistake. Their eyes were sharp and knowing, scanning him the way hunters assess wounded prey. Cale kept his voice steady. "You lost?" he asked. The leader's lips twitched. "No, are you?" The world narrowed, sunlight seeming too bright, shadows too long. Cale had known this moment would come someday. He just didn't expect it to arrive on a quiet morning with the graves leaning behind him. The man in the blood-colored coat nudged his horse closer, boots creaking softly. "We heard a wounded woman was taken into your care last night," he said. "Apache." His voice tasted of accusation, though he spoke it lightly, like a gambler placing a coin on a table. Kyle felt his heart thud once, hard, but he didn't show it. "I didn't see anyone," he lied. The leader cocked his head, studying him with wolf-like patience. "Strange," he murmured. "Tracks say otherwise." He lifted a leather-bound notebook from his saddlebag, flipping it open to reveal a drawing, the silver emblem Sonny wore, the Thunderbird sigil stamped in its center. Cale's breath stilled. The man closed the book. "You've seen this before. Not a question. A fact, carved clean." Kyle swallowed, throat tight. "What do you want?" he asked. The leader's smile came slow and cruel. "The woman. Ransom. And what she carries." Kyle felt the ground sway beneath him. If these men got their hands on Sonny, whatever truth she held, the truth his father died for, would vanish into dust. He forced calm into his voice. "I don't know anything about her." The leader exhaled sharply, disappointed. "Shame, then," he said, "because the last man who lied about her burned." Kyle didn't breathe until the riders turned away, heading toward the far edge of Blackwater Gulch. He waited until their silhouettes dissolved into heat shimmer, then sprinted for his horse. Lark whinnied as he unhitched her, sensing the urgency in his movements. He mounted before settling fully in the saddle, urging her into a gallop. The wind whipped past his face, stinging his eyes as he rode hard for the cabin. Rage and fear tangled inside him, twisting tighter with each hoofbeat. His father's emblem, these men knowing his name. The way the leader spoke as if Cale were a ledger entry long overdue. Sonny had warned him, but he had underestimated the danger. He had underestimated them. When the cabin came into view, Cale's stomach dropped. The door hung open, one hinge broken clean. The ground bore the marks of boots, not Apache moccasins, but heavy-soled riders. Cale slid from the saddle before Lark fully stopped and burst into the cabin, knife drawn. Inside, sunlight slanted across the floor in harsh white bars. The table was overturned, the water basin shattered, and Sonny was gone. Her blanket lay crumpled on the floor like shed skin. Kyle's pulse roared in his ears as he knelt, searching for signs she'd fought. Blood streaked the floorboards, small but fresh. He pressed a shaking hand to it. Warm. He stood slowly, forcing air into his lungs, scanning every detail. A broken jar, drag marks near the doorway, a single turquoise bead from Sonny's necklace caught in a crack between the boards. And on the wall, burned into the wood with a heated blade, a symbol Cale hadn't seen since childhood. A thunderbird with its wings split, the sign of a broken oath. The sign used by the men who had come to his father's homestead that night all those years ago. His vision tunneled, the world tightening to a single point of pain beneath his sternum. He remembered fire, smoke, his mother shouting his secret name, Rohani, as she pushed him out the back door, moments before chaos swallowed the home. the symbol carved into their doorframe, the promise those men had made. We'll come for the boy when he becomes a man. Kyle had believed distance would save him. He had believed changing his name would erase the target. But the past had longer legs than he ever imagined. The emblem around Sani's neck wasn't an accident. She hadn't stumbled into his canyon by chance. She had come with a purpose. And now his enemies had taken her. Kyle gathered what remained of her belongings, hands trembling as he lifted her satchel. Inside lay folded cloth and an Apache carving, a small wooden bird, wings curved inward protectively. Beneath it rested a torn scrap of paper, worn thin from folding. He unfolded it carefully. His breath hitched. On the paper was a name written in his father's handwriting, Thomas Ransom, and beneath it another line, "If she finds you, trust her." Kyle sat hard on the edge of the bed, the world tilting. His father had known Sani, had trusted her, had branded her survival into Kyle's destiny before Kyle was old enough to understand what the word destiny meant. The canyon outside fell silent, the wind holding its breath. Kyle rose slowly, purpose crystallizing inside him like stone hardening under frost. Sani wasn't just a woman in danger. She was the key to everything he'd lost. His father, his name, the truth he had feared more than death. And the men who took her had no idea what they had just woken inside him. Cale slid the knife into his boot, slung the satchel over his shoulder, and stepped into the burning light. Who would find her? And when he did, the truth that awaited him would break far more than his world. It would break the men who stole her. Cale rode until the sun bent toward the west, and the dust in his throat tasted like old iron. He followed hoof marks that bled away from Blackwater Gulch, tracking 4 riders who had vanished into a low wash beyond Red Tail Arroyo. Each imprint told a small story: the length of the gallop, the weight of the rider, the way one horse had stumbled and then recovered. Kyle read them like pages. The satchel tucked against his chest held the torn scrap with his father's handwriting. The wooden bird fit in his palm like a promise and a weight both. He thought of Sani's whisper, Rohani, her eyes like coals that had not yet cooled. The canyon around him felt suddenly full of watchers. A crow lifted from a dead juniper and vanished like a secret. He kept his face low, collar up, moving with the soft urgency of a man who knows time is both enemy and ally. When he reached the arroyo, he found more than fresh prints. A small scrap of cloth snagged on a thorn bush, a smear of blood on a stone, and a boot heel mark that belonged to a man who wore the same cheap nails as the leader in the dried blood coat. Someone had taken Sani not at random, but with a ledger of details and a careful plan. That knowledge set his jaw into iron. Night settled like a blanket, and Cale rested under the lean of a broken mesquite, building a small fire from the last dry split he kept for emergencies. He wrapped the wooden bird and the paper in oilcloth and held them close as if they were a beating thing. He thought of Thomas Ransom, the father who had taught him the slow art of making small things last, how to mend a saddle, how to keep a secret from rusting, how to measure mercy. Thomas had left markers, small private codes carved beneath the threshold, initials hidden in a boot, a coin pressed into a hollow post. Now Cale understood the cruel cleverness of the men who had come that night all those years ago. They had not only destroyed a home and a family, they had created a chase, a mark to follow, a name to hunt. The ember light made his face look older than his years. For the first time in a long while, he let himself plan rather than run. He would go to the places his father had kept, the border trading posts, the old judge's ledger house, the one-armed captain's tavern, and he would ask questions that bled into threats when he needed them to. He would trade what he had for what he needed. He would not be the boy who left ashes behind. At dawn, Cale found a trail that led to a way station where riders changed mounts and messages moved like contraband. The inn called itself the Iron Spur, a stone place with a bell that announced visitors and a ledger that recorded their names in ink that still smelled of travel. Cale tied Lark behind the stable and entered with the confidence of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to find. The room inside smelled of coffee boiled too long and men's sweat. The keeper, a lean woman named Jessa with a scar across one cheek, watched him with an eye trained on trouble. He asked for news of the men with the blood coat and showed her the sketch of the Thunderbird without a word. Her face tightened like a drawn wire. "Blood trail," she murmured. They passed through 2 days ago toward Red Hollow. Came out quiet, acting like nothing. Left a ledger on the table. Paid with coin that smelled like coin a judge had hidden. She slid a corner of the ledger toward him. Kyle slid the satchel to the side and read the entries. Names paired with sums and locations. A pattern of favors and threats. At the bottom, in a hand that looked like it might be used to sign a death warrant, was a line that made him drop the book. "Keep the boy's line clean. If the woman speaks, burn the ledger." The order hardened in his gut like ice. Cale left the Iron Spur with a map drawn in his head and a slow-burning rage in his chest. He stopped only long enough to trade for a fast bay stallion and a peppered revolver with a chip in the grip. He slipped a silver coin into Jessa's palm and promised himself he'd return what he'd taken, one way or another. The road to Red Hollow cut through flatlands that shimmered with heat waves and memories. Every mile felt like the turning of a key in a lock. Along the way, he found small witnesses to Sonny's passing. A child playing at the edge of a field, who remembered a woman with a silver emblem. A wagoner who'd heard a woman scream in the night. An old trader who'd been given a carved wooden bird as payment and had pawned it for whiskey. Each testimony was a stitch in a fabric that pulled taut toward one decision. The men with the ledger were thorough and cold. They bought silence, pressed favors, and burned what burned them. They had been searching for his family's link to what they'd lost. Cale felt his father's voice in his bones, trust the small things, and knew Sonny had been carrying the smallest thing that mattered. By dusk, Cale crested Red Hollow and saw a town that had learned to hide. Homes drew close to each other, like a secret whispered into pillows. Smoke curled in small, faithful bursts from chimneys that pretended normalcy. He tethered his horse behind a butcher's and watched from the alley as men moved like chess pieces. Judge-like shoulders bent over a ledger, a captain's shadow pacing with a heavy gait. Bram Doss slipping through a back door with his laugh that sounded like rust. Cale kept to the alleys, the third-person world narrowing onto his sharp need to find Sonny and to dig up the truth his father died for. He had a list now, names etched into his mind like nails. He had a plan, crude and dangerous, but it was the only honest thing he had left. Night wrapped around the town in velvet. Lanterns winked, and behind one of them, he could see movement. Men meeting, exchanging, whispers, sealing deals. He smelled burnt wood and coffee, and the faint metallic tang of fear. Kyle set his jaw like stone and stepped from the alley into the pale light, knife already in hand. The ledger's keepers had not yet realized the chase had a new face. They had not yet learned what happens when the hunted becomes a man who will not run. Sonny woke to the smell of damp earth and cold iron, her wrists bound behind a post, driven deep into the ground. The room around her was narrow, the walls pressed from packed clay, the air heavy with the stench of men who did not fear God or consequence. A single lantern swung from a chain, casting shadows that crawled like insects across the dirt. Her head throbbed. She remembered the cabin, Cale's hands lifting her gently, the faint warmth of broth on her tongue. Then the crash of boots, the rough grip on her arms, the world turning sideways. Now she tasted blood where someone had struck her, but she did not bow her head. A ransom had once knelt beside her as a child, binding wounds that had nearly killed her. That boy's compassion had been the first mercy she ever received, and now his son, Rohani, had saved her again. She owed him truth. She owed him survival. The door scraped open, and the man in the dried blood coat stepped inside, hat in hand, smile sharp enough to cut flesh. "You've caused more trouble than you're worth," he said. Sani lifted her chin. "Then you don't know my worth." The man crouched in front of her, his boots sinking slightly into the loose earth. He dragged a wooden crate toward them and sat as though entertaining a guest. "You had something that belonged to us," he said. "A piece of silver. Old, engraved." He waited for a reaction. Sani gave him none. His smile thinned. "Your silence tells me you know exactly what I'm talking about." He leaned closer. "The Thunderbird." Sani closed her eyes for a breath, willing her heartbeat to slow. The emblem her tribe had called Atsa, symbol of protection and oath, had been entrusted to Tomas Ransom long ago, a bond sealed in blood and honor. Tomas had hidden it before he died, but Sani had found it after years of searching. She had believed she could outrun the men who wanted it, but she had underestimated their hunger. "The silver is nothing," she said quietly. "You want what it points to." The man tilted his head. "A map without a mapmaker is only decoration." He grabbed her jaw, forcing her face toward his. "So tell me, where is Thomas Ransom's son?" Sani held his gaze. "Closer than you'd like." He shoved her back against the post, anger flickering across his face. "You think he'll come for you?" he snapped. "Ransom is a ghost, a coward, a runaway child who buried his own name." Sani almost laughed. Kyle was many things. Wounded, angry, lost, but not a coward. She had seen the way he moved when danger whispered near. She had seen the fire in his eyes when she spoke his true name. The bloodcoat man paced the room, kicking a bucket aside, his frustration growing. "Tomas should have given us what we wanted," he muttered. "Would have saved everyone trouble." Sani's voice softened, but the steel remained. "You killed a good man because you were afraid of what he protected." The man stopped pacing. "No," he said. "We killed him because he chose the wrong side." He leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "And now his son will make the same choice." A cold certainty gripped Sani's chest. These men weren't just hunting Kyle. They were shaping him, pressing him toward an old prophecy she wished she'd never learned. Thomas had died to shield Kyle from this path, and now the path was rising again beneath his feet. The man motioned to someone outside. Two riders entered, dragging a small wooden trunk between them. They dropped it near Sani, dust billowing. The leader kicked it open, revealing relics stolen from Apache families, blankets, beadwork, a child's doll, and beneath it all, wrapped in deer hide, a ledger. Not just any ledger. The ledger. Her breath caught. Names, locations, trades, betrayals. The full record of the men who profited from war, who sold alliances, who made orphans and widows with ink and coin. Thomas Ransom had once protected a page from this very book, a page that named the man behind the Thunderbird murders. "You know what this is," the leader said. "Tomas stole what belonged to us. We're simply retrieving overdue debts." Sani shook her head. "You can't bury truth with ink." His expression darkened. "Watch me." He nodded to the two men. "Take her to the ridge. Tie her to the marker post. If the boy comes for her, we'll end them both in one sweep." Sani's stomach tightened, but she kept her spine straight. If she died, Kyle would walk blind into death. She couldn't let that happen. She would break herself against stone before she let these men break him. The riders hauled her outside, the sunlight blinding after hours in the dark. The world spun, but she kept her feet steady, refusing to stumble. They dragged her up the ridge toward a post scarred with old ropes, a place where warnings were left in flesh and bone. Below the ridge, the valley stretched endless and bruised, wind carrying dust like restless spirits. She felt the sting of rope biting her wrists, smelled cedar smoke rising from the camp, heard the riders' muted laughter. She lifted her face to the sky, letting the sun warm her skin. Somewhere out there, Kale was riding toward her, carrying the wooden bird and the truth his father left behind. She closed her eyes and prayed, not for rescue, but for strength. Strength to hold until he arrived. Strength to tell him everything. Strength to keep him alive long enough to choose his fate. As the rider stepped back and the leader lifted his rifle, she whispered to the wind, "Rohani, hurry!" Why, that moment, in the distance, a lone rider crested the horizon, fast, determined, dust rising like smoke behind him. Kyle had come. One way or another, the ridge would taste blood before sunrise. Kyle reached the ridge by twilight, the sky bruised purple and gold, the world holding its breath as he reined Lark into a hard stop. His heart pounded like a fist against ribs when he saw Sani tied to the marker post, her silhouette carved against the dying sun. She stood upright despite the ropes, head high, a figure cut from courage and bone. The man in the dried blood coat waited a few paces from her, rifle slung lazily, as if he'd already written the ending. Two more riders flanked him, boots planted in the dust, faces hungry for violence. Kyle felt a cold fire coil inside him, not panic, not fear, but the sharp, terrible clarity of a man who has run out of time. He slid from the saddle, hands raised slightly, not in surrender, but in promise. "Let her go," he called. The leader smirked. "You're late, Ransom." Kyle stepped closer, measuring distances the way his father taught him, the angle of the sun, the length of a shadow, the time it took for a rifle to rise. Sani's eyes met his, dark and steady. "Rohani," she whispered without sound. And Kyle knew. They meant to kill her first. The leader stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel. "Tomas protected the wrong people," he said. "Did you think we wouldn't fix his mistake?" Kale's jaw clenched so hard it ached. "My father protected truth," he answered. "You killed him because you feared it." The man laughed, loud and sharp. "Truth? Truth doesn't matter. Only power does. And your father held something powerful, something he passed to her." He jerked his chin toward Sani. Kyle glanced at her, noticing the small cut on her temple, the way her breath trembled but didn't break. The leader lifted his rifle casually, aiming not at Kale, but at her heart. Kale's mind snapped into a storm of images. Thomas kneeling beside a wounded child, the Thunderbird emblem in his mother's hand, the night their home burned. He took one slow step forward. "If you kill her," Kale said quietly, "you'll never find what my father protected." The leader paused. A flicker, curiosity, shifted in his eyes. Behind him, one of the riders shifted nervously. Sani exhaled as if Kale had bought her one more heartbeat, maybe two. Kale didn't wait for permission. He lowered his hands and reached slowly into his coat, pulling out the wooden bird wrapped in cloth. Wind hissed over the ridge as he unwrapped it, revealing its carved wings. The leader's expression tightened. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Kyle held it up, letting the fading sunlight catch its grain. My father left it for me, he said, and you'll never understand its meaning without me. The man's temper flared. He motioned for his men to move. Take it from him. But the riders hesitated. Something in Cale's stance, or the bird itself, unnerved them. Sani watched with fierce, unblinking focus. She knew what Cale was risking. If the enemy realized the carving was only a clue and not the treasure they wanted, he'd die where he stood. The leader stepped closer, eyes fixed on the wooden bird. "Give it to me," he snarled. Kyle shook his head. "Untie her first." A stunned silence. Then the man threw his head back and laughed. "You think you're in any position to negotiate?" Cale held the bird above the canyon edge. "If I fall," he said, "so does the only key you have left." The laughter died instantly. A long, taut moment stretched between them. A moment that felt like the ridge itself might crack under the weight of all the choices buried here. The leader's jaw worked, anger battling calculation. He raised a hand, signaling his men to pause. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You're bluffing," he said. Kyle's fingers loosened over the canyon. The wooden bird swayed in the wind. Sani's eyes widened, not in fear, but in understanding. She knew Kyle had committed fully. If this ridge demanded blood, he would shed his own before surrendering hers. The leader cursed under his breath. "Fine," he growled. "Cut her loose." One rider stepped toward Sani, knife drawn. She closed her eyes as the blade sliced the ropes. Her arms fell limp at her sides, numb, but free. Kyle didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Not until she stepped away from the post. "Now," Kyle said, voice colder than stone, "we walk away." The leader's eyes flicked between them and the wooden bird, the thing he wanted more than their lives. He nodded once. "Go," he said, "but the bird stays." Kyle shook his head slowly. "No, the bird stays with me." The leader's face twisted in fury. "Then neither of you will leave this ridge alive." Before the words fully left his mouth, Kyle hurled the wooden bird into the air, not over the cliff, but straight towards Sani. She caught it against her chest just as Kyle lunged, grabbing her arm and dragging her into a sprint. Gunfire exploded behind them, bullets tearing into rocks, dust flying in vicious sprays. Kyle shielded her with his body, pushing her down a narrow goat path that dropped into the canyon. The world became noise and shadow. Gunshots, shouts, sliding gravel. Sani clutched the bird, breath ragged. "This way," she gasped, pointing toward a split in the canyon wall. They stumbled through it, just as bullets shattered stone inches from their backs. Kyle didn't stop running until the ridge was a smear of darkness behind them. They collapsed under the shelter of an overhang, chests heaving. Kyle touched her face, checking for wounds. She touched his hand in return, a small, trembling gesture full of meaning and apology. "You shouldn't have risked that," she whispered. Kyle swallowed, hard. "I wasn't risking the bird," he said, eyes locked on hers. "I was risking myself." Sani looked down at the carving. "Rohani, now I must tell you the truth." Her voice trembled under the weight of what came next. "Your father didn't die protecting a secret. He died protecting you." Sani held the wooden bird in both hands as if it were a living heartbeat. The canyon wind moved around them in slow, mournful currents, carrying dust that clung to their skin like old memory. Kyle waited, breath tight, shoulders still trembling from the run. The ridge above glowed faintly with torches as the riders searched, their shadows stretching long and thin like hunting wolves. Sani's voice came soft, cracked by exhaustion but unbroken. "Rohani, your father saved me because he believed no one is born cursed. Not Apache, not settler, no child." She touched the carving with her thumb, tracing its curved wings. I was 8 when they took me, the men in coats, the same ones who ride tonight. Kyle's stomach tightened. Sonny continued, eyes fixed on a memory far away. They wanted this bird, not because of what it is, but because of what it leads to. A ledger older than their greed, filled with the names of those who sold our lands, traded our families, and made empires from stolen breath. She looked at him then, something fierce and aching in her gaze. Your father hid that ledger. He hid it so you could live long enough to understand why he died. Kyle felt something collapse inside him, a wall he had built stone by stone over years of silence. My father never told me, he whispered. Sonny shook her head gently. He couldn't. They were watching. They wanted a child they could mold, not a boy who knew who he was. She took a slow breath. Thomas wasn't killed for protecting me. He was killed because he refused to turn you over to them. Kyle's world shifted violently, as if the canyon floor tilted beneath him. The night his father died reassembled itself in his mind. The shouts, the fire, his mother pushing him out the back door. The symbol burned into the homestead wall. He remembered Thomas whispering in a language Cale scarcely understood. Stay hidden. Live free. He had always believed Thomas died protecting a secret that did not concern him. But now, the truth twisted through him like a blade. He had been the target all along. Sonny touched his shoulder lightly. You carry blood they fear. Blood that can expose them. Blood that remembers everything they try to bury. Kyle swallowed hard. What do they want from me? She answered with a sorrowful certainty. To erase you, to finish what they began. He looked at her then, truly looked. The exhaustion, the courage, the quiet grief carried in her bones. She had been the only witness to his father's last act of mercy. She had survived years of running because Thomas trusted she would someday find his son. And she had. Cale tightened his grip on the canyon stone, grounding himself. Why now? He asked. Why chase us now? Sonny glanced back toward the ridge where torches still flickered. Because the ledger is close, closer than you think. She lifted the wooden bird, turning it until its wings caught the moonlight. This carving is the key, not to treasure, to truth. Your father carved the pattern himself. He hid directions within it, so only someone who shared his blood could see the path. Kyle frowned. But I saw nothing. Sonny nodded. You haven't looked the right way. She turned it again, showing him the underside of the wings. Kyle's breath caught. In the grooves, faint, nearly invisible, was a pattern that resembled a map, a canyon, a river bend, a mark that looked exactly like the ridge where Thomas was buried. Sonny's voice shook. It leads to where he hid the ledger, and to the truth he died to protect. Kyle stared at the carving, his father's hand now alive within the grain. Shock softened into understanding, then hardened into resolve. We find it, he said. Tonight. But Sonny shook her head. We can't. Not yet. They'll expect that. They're waiting. She pointed to a narrow path twisting deeper into the canyon. We hide until dawn. Move when the light breaks. They fear daylight. It forces them to be seen. Kyle hesitated, every muscle urging him to run toward his father's grave and uncover whatever truth waited beneath the soil. But Sonny's eyes were steady. Trust me, she whispered. Your father did. He exhaled slowly, letting her words settle into the space between them. For years he had run from a ghost he believed was his own shame. Now he understood. He had been running from a war he didn't know he'd inherited. The ridge above erupted in shouts. The riders had found their trail. Kyle grabbed Sonny's hand, guiding her into the narrow passage. The stone walls narrowed around them, forcing them close, their breaths mingling in the dark. "Stay with me," he said. Sani squeezed his hand once. "I crossed half the desert to reach you," she whispered. "I'm not leaving now." They moved deeper until the canyon opened into a small hollow, shaped like a bowl carved by time. Moonlight dripped through the jagged opening above, soft and silver. Kyle dropped to one knee, examining the wooden bird again, tracing the map lines with his thumb. "If this really leads to the ledger," he murmured, "then my father knew this day would come." Sani lowered herself beside him, exhaustion pulling at her shoulders. "He hoped it would never come," she corrected, "but he prepared for the chance that it might." Her voice softened. "He believed you would choose the right path when the day arrived." Kyle's chest tightened. "And if I choose wrong?" Sani looked at him with a depth that belonged to someone who had loved and lost more than one lifetime's worth. "Then everything dies with us," she said simply. "But if you choose right, the truth will destroy the men who hunted your family." Footsteps echoed faintly above the canyon. Kyle closed his eyes, steadying his breath. The night was closing in. The truth was rising. And dawn, when it arrived, would demand a reckoning neither of them could escape. "Tomorrow," Kyle whispered, gripping the carving. "Tomorrow, we find my father's grave." Dawn bled slowly across the canyon, painting the sky in thin strokes of rose and ash as Kyle and Sani climbed toward Redstone Ridge. The world felt quieter than it should have, too still, too watchful, as though every shadow held its breath. Kyle kept the wooden bird tucked inside his coat, the map etched beneath its wings, burning like a second heartbeat against his chest. His boots struck stone with careful purpose, while Sani followed close, her step steady despite the fatigue weighing down her limbs. She had slept less than an hour. He had not slept at all. The truth waiting ahead felt heavier than the satchel slung across his back, heavier even than the memory of Tomas's buried warnings. "Are you ready?" Sani whispered as they neared the ridge. Kyle didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure readiness mattered. He wasn't sure it ever had. But he looked at her, at the strength woven into her scars, at the fire in her gaze, and he nodded once. "Whatever we find," he said, "we face it together." She breathed out shakily, and for a moment the canyon felt less like a tomb and more like a promise. The ridge opened before them like a broken jaw, stone teeth jutting from the earth. Kyle led her toward the far edge, where scattered junipers leaned crookedly toward sunlight. Tomas had once chosen this place for Sunday prayers and quiet thinking. Now it felt like a crossroads between worlds. Kyle knelt, running his fingers across the loose gravel. Sani watched him with a reverence usually reserved for sacred ground. "Your father marked the way," she murmured, pointing to a carved symbol barely visible beneath dust, two opposing lines crossing like wings mid-flight. Kyle brushed dirt aside, uncovering small chisel marks arranged in a circular pattern, a map within a map. He followed the pattern with his fingertips, tracing a path that curved around a fallen stone slab. Beneath it, soil had been disturbed long ago, then packed again with care. His pulse hammered. "Help me," he said, voice hoarse. Together they pushed, the slab shifting with a low groan. Earth split open beneath the weight, revealing a hollow dark enough to swallow daylight whole. Kyle stared into it, as if staring into his own history. "He hid something here," Kyle whispered, "something he feared would destroy us." They climbed down into the hollow, the air cool and damp, carrying the stale scent of time sealed away. Their footsteps echoed softly as they reached a small cedar box nestled in, the soil like a heart preserved beneath ribs. Kale brushed dirt from its lid, revealing the Thunderbird emblem burned deep into the wood. Sani's breath hitched. "This is it," she whispered. "The ledger." Kyle lifted the box with trembling hands, feeling the weight of every year he had lived, not knowing who he truly was. The lid creaked as he opened it. Inside lay pages, bound in rawhide, ink faded, but legible. Names, dates, transactions, betrayals. A map of corruption stretching across decades. Sonny traced a finger over the first page, stopping when she reached a familiar name. Thomas Ransom. Beneath it, in smaller script, guardian of the ledger until rightful heir is born. Kyle felt the ground tilt beneath him. This wasn't just a record. This was a legacy forced upon a man who never wanted it. Sonny turned another page and froze. The next entry was worse. A list of men bound by blood oath to keep the ledger hidden. At the top, the judge, Bram Doss, the captain, and the man in the dried blood coat. Kyle closed the ledger, heart pounding hard enough to shake the box. "They killed him because he refused to give this up," he said, voice cracking like brittle stone. Sonny touched his forearm gently. "No," she corrected. "They killed him because he chose you instead of them." The words pierced him deeper than any blade. He saw Tomas again, kneeling in the lamplight, eyes tired but determined, pushing Kyle through the back door while fire ate the walls, whispering promises he never had time to explain. Kyle had lived his entire life believing he abandoned his father. Now he understood. Tomas died buying his son a future built on truth, not fear. Kyle wiped dust from the ledger's cover, his hand steadying as understanding settled into resolve. "We take this to Blackwater," he said. "Expose them. End this." Sonny hesitated. "They'll hunt us harder than before." Kyle met her gaze. "They're already hunting us." Something softened in her expression, a mix of admiration and grief. "Your father would be proud," she whispered. Kyle swallowed, unable to speak. Pride was a word he hadn't heard in years. A distant crack shattered the stillness, a rifle shot echoing off stone. Kyle jerked upright, pulling Sonny behind a boulder just as a second shot rang out, splintering rock where they had stood moments before. Voices carried across the ridge, rough and triumphant. The men in coats had found them. Kyle shoved the ledger into his satchel and grabbed Sonny's hand. "We run," he said. She nodded, gripping the wooden bird tightly. They scrambled back toward the canyon path as bullets screamed past them, tearing into earth and stone. Kyle led her down the slope, boots sliding in loose gravel, the ridge collapsing behind them in a violent roar of gunfire. He didn't look back. Not yet. Not until they reached a narrow ledge where they could breathe without tasting death. Only then did he turn, eyes burning with fury and clarity. The men who killed his father were here. They had followed him to the grave itself, and now they wanted the ledger, not just to hide their crimes, but to erase the last witness to Tomas's sacrifice. Kyle tightened his grip on the satchel. "This ends tonight," he said. Sonny pressed her forehead lightly to his shoulder. "Then we face them," she whispered. "Together." Night fell fast over Redstone Ridge, turning the canyon into a bowl of shadows dripping with danger. Kyle and Sonny moved through the narrowing paths, breath sharp, boots striking stone with frantic rhythm. Behind them, the men in coats spread across the ridge like wolves cutting off escape routes. Torches burned in their fists, lighting the darkness in jagged bursts of orange. Kale felt the ledger thumping in his satchel, each beat echoing the truth his father once died to protect. Ahead, the canyon opened toward Blackwater Gulch, 1 mile of bare land, no cover, no mercy. If they reached the town, they could expose the ledger. If not, Kyle pushed the thought away. Wind howled through the narrow pass, carrying dust and the faint metallic scent of danger. Sonny stumbled, but caught herself before falling. He grabbed her hand. "Stay with me," he whispered, voice raw. She nodded once, determination pulling her upright. "Your father didn't die so we could fail here," she said, her voice trembling yet strong. Kyle tightened his grip, and together they ran toward the ridge's exit, where moonlight glimmered like a thin path of hope stretched across the desert floor. They reached the open basin, just as a rifle cracked behind them, the bullet screaming past Kyle's ear. He pushed Sonny to the ground behind a boulder. "They're too close," she gasped. Voices drifted across the basin, rough, confident, closing in. The leader's voice cut through the night like a broken blade. "Cale Ransom, drop the ledger, and maybe we leave the girl breathing." Cale's blood froze. Sonny tensed beside him. He knew these men. Mercy wasn't in their vocabulary. Cale rose just high enough to see shadows spreading across the ridge. They were fanning out, circling the basin, cutting off every escape except the long stretch toward town. He glanced at Sonny. "We make for Blackwater." She shook her head. "We'll never reach it before they fire again." Kyle swallowed hard. "We don't need to reach it. We need them to think we're trying." Her brow furrowed. "You're planning something?" He offered a thin, dangerous smile. "My father didn't teach me to run in straight lines." He reached for his father's knife, gripping it like memory-made steel. "Stay low. When I move, you move." And before she could protest, he exploded from behind the boulder like a storm breaking open. Gunfire erupted immediately, bullets tearing into the earth around him as he zigzagged across the basin. He felt the heat of near misses, heard the shouts of confused riders. Kyle threw himself behind another rock, drawing fire away from Sonny. She sprinted to a second ridge as planned, clutching the wooden bird and keeping her body low. Kyle peeked around his cover. 3 riders were heading toward him. 2 veered toward her. Rage flared through him like wildfire. He darted out again, drawing their aim, forcing them to follow him instead. Sonny reached the base of a dry creek bed and slid into its shadows. She scanned the ridge, heart pounding with fear. Not for herself, but for him. She saw the leader, standing tall against the torchlight, rifle raised, tracking Cale's movements. The man steadied his aim. Sonny didn't think. She simply moved. She scrambled out from the creek bed, grabbed a fist-sized rock, and hurled it with every ounce of strength. It struck the rifle barrel, knocking the shot off course. The bullet struck stone inches from Cale's skull, showering sparks. The leader roared in fury, turning toward her. Sonny froze. Cale didn't. He charged the ridge full force, knife glinting. The desert held its breath. Cale reached the leader in seconds, slamming him into the rocky wall. The rifle clattered to the ground. The man snarled, throwing a punch that split Cale's lip, but Kyle didn't let go. Years of swallowed anger, grief, and running lit his veins like fire. "You murdered my father," Kyle growled. "You hunted a child." The leader spat blood. "We hunted the truth. Thomas should have handed you over." Kyle slammed him again, knife at his throat. "Why?" The man laughed, breath ragged. "Because you carry the one thing we couldn't buy. Proof." He jerked his chin toward the satchel. "That ledger destroys every man who built Blackwater's empire. Judges, captains, chieftains, even your precious Thomas played his part." Cale's grip faltered for a fraction. "Liar." The leader's eyes gleamed. "Thomas hid the ledger to save himself. Not you, not the tribe, himself." The words pierced Kyle in a way bullets never could. For a heartbeat, the world tilted. The truth he'd carried warping beneath him. But Sonny's voice cut through the fracture. "Kyle, don't listen!" She ran toward them, breathless. "Your father died protecting us. Protecting you. Not them." Her hand touched Cale's back. Steady, grounding, true. And in that instant, Kyle knew the leader was lying. Thomas Ransom had never chosen greed. He had chosen love. Rage snapped through Kyle like a whip, but it was no longer blinding. It was righteous. He shoved the leader away from the ridge edge, but didn't let him fall. "This ends tonight," Kyle said. "Not with another grave, but with truth." The leader sneered. "Truth won't matter if no one lives to tell it." He whistled sharply. More riders surged forward, circling Kale and Sonny. Torches raised, guns cocked, the basin lit with fire. Kale stepped in front of Sonny, shielding her with his body. She gripped the wooden bird, holding it like the memory of everyone she'd lost. The leader raised his arm, about to give the order that would end them both, when another sound broke through the night. Hoofbeats, dozens, thunder rolling across the desert. From the east ridge emerged riders painted with white ash and red clay, Apache warriors led by a gray-haired elder, whose presence split the darkness like dawn rising. His voice boomed across the basin. "Enough blood." The men in coats froze. Kale felt Sonny sag with relief. The elder's gaze burned into the leader's. "You stole from us for the last time." And with that, the desert chose its side. The desert went silent as the Apache riders swept into the basin, their horses moving like shadows cut loose from the night. The gray-haired elder rode at the front, his face carved with time and loss, his eyes lit with something deeper than anger. Memory. Kyle steadied himself, Sonny leaning against him as breath returned to her lungs. The men in coats tightened formation, torches trembling in their hands. The leader stepped forward with a smirk that cracked under the elder's gaze. "This doesn't concern your people," he said. The elder dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, as if giving the land itself time to listen. "You have taken our children," he said. "Our homes, our dead." His voice grew stronger with each word. "And now you steal the truth," he pointed to Kyle. "That boy's father died because he honored a promise." Murmurs rippled through the riders in coats, doubt creeping into their ranks. Kyle felt something inside him rise. Not fear, not rage, but the strength of a man finally standing in his rightful place. He lifted the ledger from his satchel, raising it so torchlight burned across its cover. "This ends now," he said. The leader's face twisted into panic. "Burn it! Now!" he shouted. Chaos exploded. The men in coats lunged for their rifles, but the Apache warriors were faster. Arrows slicing through torch flames, spears knocking rifles aside, horses rearing with thunderous cries. Kyle pulled Sonny behind a jut of stone, protecting her as clashes lit the night. The leader roared and charged at Kyle with a knife drawn, fury turning him animal. Kyle met him head-on, the ledger clutched in one hand while his father's blade flashed in the other. Steel met steel, sparks arcing in the dark. "You can't protect them," the leader snarled. "Your blood is stained with their lies." Kyle shoved him back, strength fueled by every year he had spent running from ghosts he didn't understand. "My father died to protect the truth," Kyle said. "What did yours die for?" The leader lunged again, but Kyle sidestepped, driving his knife into the man's forearm. The weapon clattered to the ground. The leader stumbled, screaming. Around them, battle thundered, the desert echoing with war cries and gunshots. Kyle raised the ledger high. "Sonny," he shouted, "now!" She understood instantly. She stepped into the open, lifting the wooden bird. Its carved wings glowed gold under torchlight, as if Thomas himself had carved light into wood. The basin froze. Apache warriors lowered their weapons. Even the wind paused. Sonny spoke, her voice steady despite the blood drying on her cheek. "This bird was carved to hold truth. Thomas Ransom gave it to me when I was a child. He said one day the world would need to remember who it belonged to. She lifted the carving higher. Tonight is that day. Kyle opened the ledger, pages crackling like dry leaves. Names reflected torchlight. Dates. Crimes. Proof. The leader lunged once more, desperate and wild, but the elder intercepted him with a single blow from his staff. The man collapsed to his knees, gasping. The elder looked at Kyle. "Read," he commanded. Kyle swallowed hard, then began speaking the names aloud. The judge who traded native children for land claims, the captain who sold water rights and murdered those who questioned him, Bram Doss, who forged treaties, then burned villages, and finally, the leader himself, marked as the architect behind Thomas Ransom's death. Each name fell like a stone into a river, sending ripples through the gathered men. Some of the coats threw down their weapons, shame bowing their heads. Others ran. Others wept. The elder turned to the leader. "Your ledger is finished. The people decide your ending." The night held its breath once more. Kyle stepped toward the leader, breathing hard, blood drying on his shirt. "My father saved you once," the leader spat, trembling. "He could have given us the ledger and lived." Kyle shook his head slowly. "He saved you from becoming worse than you already were." The elder raised his hand, signaling his warriors. They surrounded the leader but did not strike. "Let him stand trial by the people he harmed," the elder said. "That is justice." The leader screamed curses as he was dragged away, his voice fading into the night. As the battle smoke drifted off the basin, Sani stepped beside Kyle, eyes shining with exhaustion and something softer. "Rohani," she whispered, "your father would have known pride tonight." Kyle felt tears sting his eyes, tears he had forgotten how to shed. He looked at Tomas's ledger, the wooden bird, and Sani standing beside him under the bruised moon. "I thought my father died because he was punished," Kale murmured. "Now I know he died, because he chose love over fear." Sani cupped his cheek gently. "And now, you choose the same." Dawn crept across the basin as the Apache riders escorted the surviving criminals toward Blackwater Gulch. Kyle and Sani rode together, the ledger safe between them. Townsfolk gathered as truth spread like wildfire. Names confessed, crimes exposed, the shape of justice finally visible after years of shadow. The judge was arrested before sunrise. Bram Doss fled, but was caught by noon. And the ledger became the town's mirror, forcing everyone to reckon with the reflection staring back. As the sun climbed higher, Kyle stood at Thomas Ransom's grave with Sani beside him. Wind moved through the junipers, gentle as a father's hand. Kyle placed the wooden bird at the base of the stone. "I'm done running," he whispered. "I'm your son again." Sani slipped her hand into his. "And you are not alone." He turned toward her, heart steady for the first time in years. "Stay," he said softly. She smiled, tears gathering in her dark lashes. "Always." Together they walked down the ridge, two lives tied by fate, two hearts bound by truth, and a future finally free to breathe. And as they descended into sunlight, Kyle felt it, the past releasing him, and the world beginning anew.